thank you, first of all, for agreeing to talk with us today. And I just want to make sure I get your name correct. It's Alane Daugherty?
Daugherty.
Daugherty?
Yeah.
Daugherty.
It looks harder than it is.
Okay, fair enough. And do you want to be called Dr. Daugherty or Alane or?
Either's fine.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Alane's fine. My students actually call me Dr. Alane because it's a lot easier than Daugherty.
Daugherty. All right.
But Alane is fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Could I ask what field you specialize in? Like, what would you designate that as?
What would I designate that? I would, oh boy, emotional healing, in the kind of more the psychophysiology of emotional healing.
Okay.
But that's a lot of big words for mind, body, spirit connection and intentionality of wellness, you know.
And does that correlate with, like, your doctorate, like what you studied?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
It was all of the focus of my doctorate just became all of this work.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. So, like, you have, like, a PhD in, like...
Well, it's in education, but it's the
right.
reason why it's in education is because the person that I wanted to work with at Claremont Graduate University was doing this work, and she just happened to be in that department.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have any prior careers to this?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was growing up, I was always pretty intuitively a spiritual person, and kind of really have always really lived in my body and didn't really know how to live that way, if that makes any sense. It just, I wasn't really comfortable with that, and with kind of the understanding of the whole spirituality aspect of what I was always feeling in my body, because I've always felt my spirituality and felt my emotional state really pretty intensely in my body, and in that connection of the universe that way. And so because I didn't at that time, there wasn't anybody studying this.
Right.
There was either psychology, which was all about the brain and the mind, or there was physiology, which was all about the body,
right.
and these two disciplines weren't talking to each other at all. And psychology didn't explain it well enough for me, and so I went really into physiology. So I got really into just the body. My master's degree was in exercise science, and I was always intensely interested in what I would call wellness. And it's always taken this, I was really interested in psychology, and that wasn't quite it. So then I just kind of turned that off and went really into physiology and knew everything there is to know about the body and about the heart, the functionality of the heart was really what I was looking at. I was in cardiac rehab, and I was really into just the physiology of the body, and got further into my own personal life, and so that was a huge part of my vocation for many years. And then that just didn't explain it all. My personal life took a really serious spiritual turn, and so my personal life was all about spirituality and emotion and intentionality, and my vocational life was all about the body. And then this discipline came along called psychophysiology, and a lot of people were studying the neuroscience of spirituality and the neuroscience of emotion, and it was like all these different paths, and positive psychology was really coming out at this time too. And so all of these things that I'd always been intensely interested in, I was always into like wellness with all of these things, but nothing ever kind of coalesced together. And then all of a sudden this came up, and it was like,
so it ended
it
ended perfectly.
It ended.
How funny. All right, that's awesome. And you are the author of the book titled "The Power from Within: From Neuroscience to Transformation." And what inspired you? Oh, look at that! Nice. That was perfect.
Yeah.
What inspired you to write a book about the findings, I guess, in the field of like wellness? Like, was there a vocalizing for a demand of a book? How did that come about?
I couldn't not.
You could not, like, after you came to that.
When I got done with my dissertation, and a lot of the focus of my dissertation, all my doctoral work was on this, and I couldn't not, because I felt like there was so much information that really needed to get out, and there's so much information that I just wish I could give everybody in the world, because for being able to live a well and happy life, there's information that can help us do that and be nice to ourselves and be compassionate to ourselves in the meantime. And so yeah, there's just information that I felt that I had discovered, not discovered my own, but just through all of this academic stuff and being able to put it together in a package that people understood. I've always seen I love the lab, and I'm a science rat, and I love the science of it. But there's a lot of people doing the science of it, and unfortunately the people that are doing the science of it don't really know how to make it accessible.
Right.
And then there was a whole group of people that kind of understand some of it, but they didn't have the science background.
Right.
And so it was too fluffy, and people weren't really taking it seriously, and it was easy to dismiss. And so I've always seen myself as the bridge, and
right.
I really just couldn't not write it. And I felt like there was so much good information that people weren't getting, that the mainstream population weren't getting, or they were getting wrong, or they were getting in a way that they weren't going to buy it. And so my whole goal about writing the book was like, God, let's just be able to share this. This is important stuff. How can we begin to share this and really make a difference in people's lives? So
yeah, I would agree with that. And in the book, you devote a couple chapters to a series of techniques that you've acronymed as HEART, which stands for Higher Emotion and Refocusing Techniques. Could you explain higher emotion to me?
There are certain emotion. The word emotion itself, I feel, has really been unfairly. I feel like it's been given a bad rap.
Okay.
I characterize emotion as a felt sense, and because most of the original research in emotion was on emotion in its chaotic state, emotion in itself got this bad reputation. And unfortunately, it also got associated with the gender, which I think is really unfair. But a felt sense of something, when we feel something, that's an emotional state. When we feel gratitude, or we feel love, or we feel grounded, or we feel purpose, or we feel potential, those are all emotions too. And so for me, it's really hard. I love the concept of what a grounded emotion is, and I think that's the most powerful thing that we can have. And unfortunately, because people misunderstand the word emotion, there's like a higher, and I even struggle with the term higher and lower, or positive and negative. Or there's no doubt that there are a certain group of emotional states that lead to a higher sense of well-being. There's no doubt about that, when we really rest in those. And there's no doubt that there's a group of emotions when they're chaotic and they're destructive, and we absolutely live and dwell in those states, that it's destructive to our well-being. Some research, and I actually like this characterization of maladaptive as far as adaptive. What makes us healthy, what emotional states make us healthy. And so the higher emotion was in reference to the set of emotions that really lead to a greater sense of well-being.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and refocusing was being able to intentionally cultivate the emotional states that lead to a higher sense of well-being.
Okay.
So there's a systematic way to do that.
Right. And you explain briefly in Chapter 6 that the function of the exercises would be to reduce or transform negative reactive patterns into more positive ones. How did you come up with the concept of target, like this systematic way of being able to achieve that higher or better emotional?
Because there's so much really, really, really good information in the science and the neuroscience and contemplative practice and all kinds of meditation practices. And my experience with Western culture is people aren't going to do it if it's too much. If it's, you got to tell them that they got to meditate 5 hours a day and they got to, do something that feels very uncomfortable. So my goal was to take the information as much as I could decipher of the points that were really important and be able to put it into a package that was very easily accessible and that people would actually do. So it didn't feel too foreign to their way of being, and it didn't feel too, uncomfortable, or it didn't, unfortunately, a lot of people associate contemplative practice with only specific religions, and then if they're afraid of that religion, then they'll put off any kind of practice like that. And so my whole goal was just to make it easy and accessible so people would actually do it.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Good. And I believe these, common steps you're talking about are the ones that you talked about: notice, refocus, and nurture. Mm-hmm. Could you just very briefly, go through, what that is and how, in those very accessible terms, I guess?
Okay. So I would need to ground this in, first of all, I kind of define body. I mean, what makes us human is that we live in our human bodies. Mm-hmm. And so I define body as not just this thing from our shoulders down, that our body is this thing that carries us through our life as we're human, as long as we're human and as long as we're alive. And we know that our bodies are systems of adaptation. We didn't used to know that, especially our brain. And the concept of neuroplasticity came along, in the late 90s, and it was like, wow, you can really change your brain. And since then, there's been research about how intentionally changing, and these are my words, but this is kind of the culmination of all the science, intentionally changing internal experience actually cultivates more of the same experience. And we've always kind of known that, but now we have the science to back it up. And so those 3 steps are really basically, as much as I could, and as much as I could understand the science, and as much as, because this was the focus of my doctoral work, I spent a lot of time reading and deciphering and trying to get what was important and what was not important. And so the notice, refocus, and nurture is just kind of 3 basic steps of how do we begin to, number 1, step away from the pattern when it's reactive and chaotic and kind of coming from a place that's not grounded. And how do we, because I have something also called the perception cycle that I write about, that perception creates thoughts and emotions, which creates a physiological response, which goes back and changes our perception. The perception is always dependent on what's going on in our body and brain at any given time. And so if we can take a step away from that and just calm, and then we can do certain things physiologically that is actually going to change our perception. So the first step, notice, is just kind of to just notice the reactivity, because any internal reactivity is going to carry a physiological response. So if we can just tune into our body and say, oh wow, I'm really triggered right now, I'm really reactive, something's going on for me, and just disengage, not suppress, which is very different, but just get disengaged from the reactivity. Because our body has something, or our brain has something called the law of associative memory. And so one kind of firing of an idea or a feeling leads to another, and pretty soon we're in this reactive state. And if we can just stop that and routinely stop it, then pretty soon we're changing our patterns. So notice just begins to just gain a little distance from that. And then refocus is going into the physiological things that will actually calm us down. Just releasing. Your eyes are incredibly connected to your emotional system. So just release your eyes, your whole system calms down. Same things with your shoulders. The breath, volumes and volumes and volumes have been written on the breath. So the refocus is just refocusing your physiological state to get to a calmer state. So the notice is just disengage from the reactivity. The refocus is just, okay, so now let's kind of just calm our physiology down so we can be in a calmer, grounded state. And then the nurture is intentionally nurturing, you know, what I was calling in the book a higher emotional state, or a grounded or an adaptive emotional state, or something like that, to be able to then begin to intentionally cultivate a different response.
Right.
And the more we do that, the more our body adapts to it, and that really becomes our way of being in the world. It's not just momentarily.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. Okay. So you'd say over the course of time you can do this enough, you will be able to systematically change the way you respond based on, like, I guess, reteaching, like, the way you...
Yeah. What you're doing is you're reteaching your body, and so any kind of trauma that we've ever had in our whole life, big, little trauma, you know, little stuff, little anxieties, test anxiety, or huge trauma isn't in the event. The event's over. But we carry it all the time because it's wired in our neural networks. And this is rewiring our networks.
Gotcha.
You know, it really is that simple and that hard.
Right.
You know, but it really is that. That's what it is. I mean, we operate from the way our wiring is, and that's all from experience. It's all from internal experience. So we intentionally change an internal experience, and we intentionally begin to rewire the way we are in the world. And so we see functional changes, which are momentary changes, but we also see structural changes. We actually see structural changes in the brain when you do practices. And they're engaged practices, but they're also practices in a moment of stress. So they're very kind of coming from both directions.
Right.
You know.
And I want to veer off my notes for a second because I just want to ask personally. You have a lot of, like, religious paraphernalia, like, everywhere. Do you, like, take aspects of every religion, like, in your studies, or is this more of a personal thing, or?
It's both.
Okay.
And my husband and I do the work, same typical work, so, you know, both of it's kind of combined from both of us. But yeah, all of this stuff came for me from a real serious spiritual search. And at the same time, what goes on in the body and the emotionality of it doesn't require the spirituality aspect. So I don't always represent it. For me, that's what it comes from.
Right.
And for me, that deepest place of groundedness comes from a spiritual place. But for people, there's so many people that have been victims of what we call religious abuse, or, you know, something where anything that even smacks of spirituality or religion turns them off. And so I'm really careful about presenting this in both ways.
Right.
You know, not either or, because for me it's not an either or, but being able to refocus your emotional attention and really cultivate a different internal experience doesn't necessarily mean that you need to believe in a spirituality either.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So you'd argue that it's more, what's more important would be, like, the person's place of comfort, like wherever they can come from.
That person's the goal is to get to your deepest place of centeredness. And for a lot of people that is a sacred space, and for some people it's not, because, you know, whatever, that's carries too much woundedness in the past, and so it just needs to be a place of self, and that's fine too.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. And you've mentioned it a lot in this interview, and also in your book. You distinctly, like, discuss physical, physiological, and psychological attention when it comes to these techniques. And I think you briefly mentioned it, but I'd like you to go in maybe a little bit more into how you believe that the physical and emotional and mental are, like, inseparable.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
You can't separate them.
Right.
And I think in the past, in disciplines, people have always tried to make them separate, and you just can't. You know, if I asked you, right, if I took your, you know, I could take a saliva swamp of your cortisol right now, and then I could just say, think of something that really makes you angry, and then take another swipe, and it would completely change all through your body. And every cell and every organ in your body has receptor sites for various biochemicals. I mean, every cell is affected by what your current emotional state is. and then they adapt. They'll actually grow more receptor sites for specific biochemicals. Sometimes your body, it just depends on what biochemical is. Sometimes your body will shut it down because there's too much. I mean, the body adapts in all different kinds of ways, but it cannot be separated.
Okay.
I mean, it just can't be separated.
All right. And how much of these revelations of wellness are based on personal experiences, and then how much would you say are based on your research throughout your education?
I can't say. I mean, I can't separate it.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
And that's a really fair question, because a lot of times when I'm teaching, I actually had a student once, because I was actually talking about the heart techniques, and he raised his hand. He says, "I want to know if you do them."
Mm-hmm.
And it stunned me, because I never thought that somebody would even have the concept that I'd be up there teaching them if I really didn't do them. But then I thought, oh, that makes total sense. You know what I mean? It's just that my life has been so immersed in them, and honestly, I have there's a period of probably 10 years of my life that I could not have made it through without them. Mm-hmm. I couldn't have. So it's as much a personal as the academic, and the academic has been a passionate search to be able to explain it. I like to explain things. Because I'm such a kinetic person, I feel things so much in my body. To be able to explain it, it just made so much sense to me. Mm-hmm. And then to be able to share that with other people and say, hey, this is what's going on. A lot of people, it helps. They buy into the ability to change with intentionality if you can really give them the science behind it.
Right.
They, okay, I really get it now, so that makes really sense. You're not just some hoo-hoo, and it makes a lot of sense. And so for me, I just can't, I wouldn't even know where to begin to say what is personal and what is academic.
Fair enough. So, you've brought up your own personal experiences when discussing and teaching with a student. You've divulged some of your personal self to that person in an effort to get them to understand, how they can come to it personally as well?
All the time. I tell stories all the time.
Okay.
I suffered from anxiety so bad at a certain time in my life, I was afraid to go out of the house. Mm. I mean, I know what severe anxiety is like. Mm-hmm. I've been through, we all seem to have, things that seem to come up as major repeated trauma in our life. Mm-hmm. I've had, I know death well. Mm-hmm. I've had many, many, many very, very close people in my life dies. I know grief well. I know there's just certain things that I know well, and I wouldn't have been able to make it through without this. And so I'm really honest about sharing that.
Okay.
And it helps. I mean, with my students, they just get it. Yeah. They get it more. One of the things that I have my students do is they write journals. And so they learn the content, but then their goal in the whole class is take the content and to really make it, how does this really play out for you? What does this mean to you? And so they get to some pretty deep places, but it's a really great insight for me, because then I get to really read how they processed and how they internalize the information. And a lot of times they'll say, gosh, it just made it so real when you shared this story, or when you shared that story, or when you know.
Right.
But then I've also had students go, God, I can't believe how much she shared.
Right. Well, that's why I asked, because I feel there are people on both sides of the fence where some people would argue that's very narcissistic sort of thing, and how, it's about the students, why would you bring that up? But I would argue that it's almost a better advocacy when you are able to validate what you're arguing through your own personal experience.
Right.
So okay. So I wondered if you had people on both sides of that fence as well.
Right.
When you've taught.
Right.
Yeah.
And honestly, sometimes there's a student that's just not. It presses too many buttons and they're not ready to go there yet, and I totally get that as well. Mm-hmm. And so every once in a while I get somebody that's just really not.
Yeah, just stop for...
Just, yeah, and it comes out as really anger and hatred a lot. Mm-hmm. I had one student once that, he's writing in his journal just Just all kinds of interesting, I mean, F you and on and on, and that's all he was writing the whole quarter. And then he, you're always making us write about the same stuff, and over and over and over and over again. And I wasn't. The truth is that I wasn't. But the truth is that every time he sat down to write, something was right in his face.
Right.
So he was writing.
Right.
But it turns out that he had a pretty serious drug issue, and every time he sat down to get quiet, that was in his face.
Right.
And so, about the 7th week of the quarter, he decided to really go into rehab and really work on it. And then by the end of the quarter, I mean, it was just a whole different, it was just a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful transition. I don't always see that. Sometimes I get somebody that's really resistant and just can't go there. And that's fine too. I can reach who I can reach, and
right. Yeah. And how do you address individuals with these roadblocks and such, who are very resistant? Because I feel like you'd have a class and there would be some that are very open-minded and very willing to address their issues. They're already up there, and then some people who are way in the back. How do you deal with having people at these different levels of self-awareness? And
I just give the invitation. It's not my job to force somebody to change. It's just not. So I invite them into the process, and if they're not ready, if they're not comfortable, if that's just not where they're going to go, I'll just keep inviting. That's all I can do.
And these classes, aren't necessarily they sign up for the class, but it is a class that they do have to show up for, right? It's not they can just leave halfway through the quarter, right?
Right, but the first day of class, I make it really clear.
Right, okay.
I'm this is what it is. And I totally get it. If it's not for you, I totally get it. If it's not for you at this time, because a lot of people say, it's just, I just can't go there right now. Maybe someday, but I just can't go there right now.
Right.
And then I totally get that. And I do. There were times in my life I wouldn't have been able to go there. And I just totally get that. But the first day of class, I just say, hey, I'm going to be really honest, because I don't want you to get 3 weeks in the quarter and say, I didn't know this is what it was going to be. And and I still do get some students like that.
Right.
But as much as I can, I really try to be really as much as up front from day one.
Okay. And you've taught classes and workshops at various universities, including Claremont Graduate University, Claremont School of Theology, Colorado College, University of La Verne, Cal Poly Pomona. And why have you chosen to target college students as opposed to teaching any younger age group, or have you? Or
I have.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah, I have. In fact, all of my dissertation work was on younger kids.
Okay.
And a lot of the programs that I've done. In fact, before I came, you asked kind of what my vocation was. Even before the exercise physiology part of my vocation, I was actually a K-12 teacher.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I have had a lot of experience as far as bringing these tools and techniques and stuff. It's just where I've been now.
Okay.
I do a lot of work with younger kids. It's just usually a little bit more of a game to play the administration in the K-12 than it is, than it is in college. So.
And you specifically say administration. Have you had any differences, whether it be easier or harder to address kids of a younger age with this sort of thing? Is it harder for them to grasp? Have they not suffered enough trauma to be able to recognize what you're talking about, or have you seen any differences with younger and older kids?
Yeah, there's a lot of differences, but there's still with K-12. It's just interesting because you've got to really package it. Okay for the school,
right.
Okay for the parents, and then also in a way that the kids are going to get it.
Right.
And usually the kids get it way more than the parents or the administration gets.
Yeah.
But the kids, and again, it's totally different depending on the age. But when we did the work that my dissertation was focused on was a huge grant that there were several of us working on. We just carved out pieces. For our doctoral work, and so we had 1,600 kids, high school kids, doing very similar. It wasn't this because I hadn't developed all my stuff yet, but it was very similar kind of work. we had to, for the school administration, first of all, you can't say anything that smacks of spirituality if it's in a public school.
Yeah.
So, we call it emotional management, and it was actually focused on test anxiety because that's where the money is in education. But in reality, it was the same. It was the same stuff, and it just depends. What I learned from K-12 is the buy-in is really important, and the buy-in has to come from. Teachers are so overwhelmed right now. And if you come in and tell teachers, you got to do this, and they just see it as one more program, they're not going to support it.
Right.
If you work with specific teachers that are really excited, or if it's an outside program, that's not part of the curriculum, it's an after-school program, or there's just ways that it works much better than if you come in and you tell teachers they got to teach it. And,
right.
So there's just, and I think that's why probably my experience in K-12 I don't really write about as much, like on my bio if I've done this, because usually it's in more really specific programs, because that's really the best way to get the younger kids.
Right. Okay. That's a great perspective. I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess my follow-up question for that would be, do you think that there should be a sort of effort to get public schools on board with this sort of thing? It seems like this would be good for everybody.
It would, and there's some schools that I've seen do it. When I was going through my doctoral work, there was also a friend of mine that was a principal at an elementary school, and the superintendent there, who was actually a friend of mine, kind of gave the principal the go-ahead, and because it was coming from the principal, and because the principal was so excited about it, and the parents loved the principal, then it kind of became this whole school program.
I see.
The real key is, to really get the support for the program. And like I said, if it comes in as this mandated thing, it's not gonna fly very well. But if it has the support of the principal, if it has the support of the teachers, and that whole school flourished with it. But I've also seen it really flourish in after-school programs, and it just always has to be the way that it's packaged. Because this stuff is stuff that won't work unless you really engage.
Right. Right.
And so how do you get people to really engage?
Right.
Is the whole
They
question.
need to be able to they need to be able to step up for themselves to get it.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And you mentioned journaling, but I believe you have other writing or I guess art exercises that your students will go through to get them through this heart process and stuff. What is your opinion on art and its necessity and connection with mental and emotional and spiritual well-being?
The activities that I have in the book they're just mostly written activities. They can do art if they want, but it's not. But the thing about journaling and the thing about art is that when you, if I were to sit down and write an essay, it's going to come from the left side of my brain, the very cognitive part of my brain, and the right side of your brain. I talk a lot about the inside and the outside of the brain, because the inside of the brain is really the emotional part and the outside is more the cognitive part. But if you want to go left and right, it's the right side that's more connected to the inside of the brain.
Right.
Okay, so the right side tends to be better connected to the emotional, the spiritual, the intuitive, and when you do journal writing, if it's kind of just stream of consciousness, not writing, not I'm going to try to make this. In fact, I tell my students, I don't want an essay. I don't want you to think about certain sentence structure. I don't want correct grammar, because the more that you're thinking about that, the less you're really connecting to the intuitive side.
Right.
So there's something about the process of stream of consciousness writing that accesses your intuition in a way that other writing doesn't. But that's the same thing with art. Art will go to that space where you really connect the creative, intuitive, emotional, spiritual part of your brain.
Right. my next question is about this other book.
It's in the works.
Okay, cool. Well, I will ask about it anyway since it is still in the works.
Yeah.
I believe the title still Reclaim Your Life, the art and science of transformative emotion.
I think.
You think? Okay, as far as we know.
It's one of those things that I think the title's going to come after,
No, that makes sense.
After, yeah.
Okay, that's fair. I was wondering if, like, it was just kind of hopping on your last book and, like, you're just kind of discussing it in a different context, or is it related at all, or?
It's very related.
Okay.
I've had the chance to work with thousands of people with the material since I first wrote the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from how people respond. I've learned a lot what's been misunderstood. I've learned a lot of things that I felt may have been, that I may have left out, or I may have not necessarily left out, but really highlighted as much as I think I could have.
Okay.
And I also, when I wrote the book, I wrote it in, I want the information to be more accessible and I guess, I don't know if I should say more updated. I don't mean updated in the scientific way as much as updated into kind of the growth that I've been through and what I've really learned about how to really get people to understand the material.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I guess that was a big curiosity for me. Is like, I read this book and I see all these exercises and, like, let's say they do really help me and I get to this, like, better sense of wellness or whatever. Is that, like, the end all be all? Like, do you think that you are at, like, the final point? Have you reached this sort of nirvana, or do you think it's a experience that is going to take you your lifetime, that everyone was going to take a lifetime?
Oh yeah, it's always and I even tell my students when they leave the quarter is that the information that they wrote is always going to be different, because they're always going to be different.
Mm-hmm.
But the process is always going to be valid.
Okay.
The process is something we should revisit and revisit and revisit and revisit,
Okay.
So yeah, it's not like, you get done and all of a sudden you're in nirvana and that's it.
Right.
But looking at constant growth and looking at, always, what does it mean to be well?
Mm-hmm.
And what can I do to cultivate being well?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that you do get more and more and more and more well.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that there's always room to keep, keep growing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I guess that, I think that even ties back to your last question of, the next book is kind of what's the next step to wellness for me.
Right.
And it's based a lot on this, but it's also, it's also going to be a lot more. And it's going to be more, I just want it to be made way more accessible. The first publisher that I went with this book was an academic publisher.
Mm-hmm.
Academic publishers charge textbook prices.
Oh, yeah.
So I just want to really make it more accessible.
Okay.
To get that information.
Okay. So. That's fair. And I guess my last question, and this is more related to what we're going to be talking about with future interviewees, is if, for someone who's watching this video, like, what advice would you give, or what would you tell somebody who is seeking better wellness? Like, what would be, like, the first thing that you would tell them?
Oh, boy. I think that true wellness is so dependent on the health of our emotions and our spirit and our internal experience, because that manifests in everything. It manifests in the way we perceive the world. It manifests in our behaviors. It manifests in our choices. It manifests in our physical health. And so just to be able to really take the time and the energy to cultivate ongoing internal experience in a way that cultivates wellness, I think, is the absolute key. I think just that's the key. That's where it's at. and unfortunately, there's a story I love, about somebody lost their keys, and they're looking and looking and looking for the keys, and and this lady comes, the guy's looking, so the guy's lost his keys, and he's looking and looking and looking, and the lady comes along, and she says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm looking for my keys," and she says, "Okay, I'll help you." And "Where'd you lose them?" And he says, "Well, I lost them over there." And she said, "Well, why are you looking here?" He says, "Well, because that's where the light is." And it's like, well, you got to go to where the key is. And I really think that the key to wellness is internal experience, and that there's certain things that we can do to heal. First of all, there's healing, and this is a whole nother conversation. But I think part of where positive psychology and part of where a lot of the self-help movement falls short is to look at healing. You can't just, there's got to, I call this, this is one of the things that I want to really highlight more in the next book, is I think there's a continuum of healing from some real trauma to a really high sense of well-being, and you got to pay attention to all points.
Right.
And unfortunately, positive psychology only pays attention to one side, and then pathology and psychology is always focused on what's wrong and we're going to heal what's wrong. Has only gotten people so well. And it's like, to be able to really achieve a sense of well-being, you got to focus on all points of the continuum. And it's, and we adapt to what we give ourselves. And that's kind of the underlying,